Hello, everyone. Good day to you all. Thank you all for joining us today for yet another webinar. Today, we'll be discussing what transportation agencies need to know about charging. Our moderator today will be Eric Huang, our Forts Program Manager. We will also be joined in the conversation by the Greenlining Institute, Center for Sustainable Energy, and the National Association of State Energy Officials for a great conversation. So thank you all for coming along. And I am Simbia Yusuf. I am the Member Relations Manager at Forth. And before we officially start the panel, I will have a few updates from the Forth team. Attendees, we ask that you please be sure to submit all your questions through the attendee chat as we go through. We will have some time for Q&A after all of our presentations today. We will also be sharing the webinar recording as well as the presenter slides after the webinar today. So don't worry, you'll get all of the information you need if you missed anything. And we will also include some additional resources for you all. Who are we? Forth is on a mission to electrify transportation by bringing people together to create solutions that reduce pollution and barriers to access. We are doing this work in four main focus areas, which are policy advocacy, consumer engagement, industry development, and demonstration project. We aim to advance equitable transportation through all of these efforts. Sponsorship opportunities are still available for our webinars this season, and all of our webinars and our programs wouldn't be possible without the support of members and sponsors. If you would like to learn about sponsorship opportunities and membership, you can reach out to me, Simbia Yusuf. My email is on the screen. I will also be included in the webinar recap, so you can reach out to me there as well and discuss wonderful opportunities. We are still hiring. We still have positions open. If you're interested in joining the Great Fort team and working on access to transportation, we are currently looking for a director of development and communications and senior program managers. If you're interested, or if you know someone that's interested in those positions, we will be sharing those in the webinar recap as well. And we hope you've reserved your registration for the Roadmap Conference. You can still save with the early adopter rates, which are now available. More details to come on the program and speakers and all of the good stuff around the conference. So stay tuned for more information, but register now and save using our early adopter rates. And with all of those, I will now pass it along to our moderator, Eric.
Cool. Thank you, Simbi. And obviously, there's a small lag in terms of my video feed coming through, but here I am. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Eric Huang. I'm a program manager at Forth here. I've been focusing on the work of facilitating EV charging readiness specifically in residential areas in the past couple of years. Very excited to be here. And we are joined by first Karen Glitman, Senior Director of the Center for Sustainable Energy. She has more than 30 years of policy advocacy and public service experience in advancing energy justice and tackling climate change by accelerating by accelerating access to clean, affordable, and efficient energy for all. She leads CSE's efforts to uncover new opportunities to support entities around the nation in meeting a shared goal of decarbonization. Prior to joining CSE, she spent 7 years at the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, serving roles including Director of Efficiency Vermont, Director of Transportation Efficiency, and Director of Strategy, Policy, and Public Affairs. We also have Cassie Powers, from Senior Managing Director from NACIO. Cassie Powers leads the program staff covering regional coordination, state energy planning, transportation policy, and other initiatives, and she has provided research, analysis, and facilitation support for the state energy offices on transportation and clean energy issues, and acts as a resource on state, local, and federal transportation policies. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Environmental Policy and Government from College of William and Mary, and a Master of Urban Environmental Planning from the University of Virginia. And lastly, we are joined by Leslie Aguayo, Climate Equity Program Manager at the Greenlining Institute. She is an urban planner and advocate with experience and interest in poverty alleviation, asset building, affordable housing, equitable transportation, and climate change policy for increased upward mobility in urban, suburban, and rural spaces. As a climate equity program manager at the Greenlining Institute, she works to further equitable electric vehicle policy and investments. Leslie graduated from the University of California, Berkeley, with a Master of City Planning and holds 2 Bachelors of Arts degrees in Anthropology and Urban Studies from the University of California, Irvine. So before we dive into the conversation, I do have a icebreaker question for all these panelists today. And also this is going to become up in the polling question for everyone as well, which is what is one thing that you're most excited about with the infrastructure bill? And attendees, please feel free to fill those out in the polls. And then I would invite panelists Karen to go first, and then followed by Cassie, and then lastly to just share about their thoughts. And Karen, would like to go first?
Here we go. Great, thank you, Eric. So you want my answer to the poll question, right?
Correct.
Correct. So I said the entire bill, and I said that because there are so many elements of it that are transformative, and it provides the resources to tackle a whole host of issues that are needed to accelerate decarbonization. One might not think of it, but even having smooth pavement increases miles per gallon, increases the efficiency of travel. So I think the entire bill is exciting, and I do hope that they're able to pass a budget. As we all know, this was just the authorization to appropriate the funds to get that going.
Oh, thank you, Karen. And then we'll follow this question to Cassie.
Sure. Thanks, Eric. I think that Karen's answer was a good one. Pretty excited for the whole bill. But I'm also excited about some of the support that the bill provides to the states. In addition to just the raw funding amounts, there's going to be a significant amount of technical assistance through this new Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. There's also mechanisms in the bill to collect data on station and vehicle use, create standards, et cetera. I think one of the lessons we learned from the Volkswagen settlement a few years ago is that a big pot of money is a great first step, but there needs to be some structure so that states and stakeholders can build their programs.
Yeah, thank you. Structure is the key word that I distilled there. Leslie.
Yeah, I think similarly, the entire bill provides a lot of great opportunities, but in particular, understanding how this large investment is going to be a great opportunity for communities of color and low-income communities as well that have been historically locked out of equitable and clean transportation options. But more than that, more than accessibility, it's how is this investment creating a new form of a green economy, and how can community members be a part of this new investment. So I think that that's the main thing that's really exciting for us.
Thank you, Leslie. So, without further ado, I do think we probably want to take a look at the poll results, since everybody should have already submitted their thoughts. Simbi, are we going to take a look at the poll results now, or do it later? Okay, all good.
We'll do it later.
Understood. Thank you. Well, in that case, I will pass the microphone or the virtual platform here to Karen to talk about the need for a data-driven strategy to deploy federal funding for EV charging. So, welcome, Karen.
Great. Thank you, Eric. And I bring to this conversation not just my experience that Eric talked about, but I spent a fair amount of time at a state DOT as well. So I understand state transportation agencies. So I'll just found the way to click forward. So I think a little bit about CSC. We're a 25-year-old mission-driven nonprofit with a single word mission to decarbonize, very similar to Fourth, who we've partnered with on some projects in the past. Part of that work is administering electric vehicle and electric vehicle infrastructure programs. We've done about $1 billion worth of incentives around the nation. About 30% of all the EVs on the road have come through a program that CSC has supported, and we manage EV infrastructure programs as well. So we bring our experience and our subject matter expertise, and we pair that with data to bring forth some new opportunities. So I'll share a little bit more about that as well. So the fundamental question around within the IIJA as it pertains to EV infrastructure, this $7.5 billion that's going to the states, and Cassie will talk a bit more about the format that will take. That's sort of a minimum of $7.5 billion, is to answer these three fundamental questions. How much charging is needed? Where should such charging be placed? And by when do you need to have it? So we believe that there's some data that can provide some support for the answers to those questions to help you advance effective, equitable EV charging placement. And it also can help you align that placement to meet the demand and stakeholder goals, as well as comply with the IIJA requirements and reporting. So using the plan, do, check framework can really help focus this conversation. I'm going to be focusing on this talk mostly on the plan part, but I'll discuss how data connects these three components. And then I'll also provide a brief look at a current project for the deployment of 2,000 chargers in San Diego County. So the first part that one needs to do is to think about how many vehicles are you going to need to support with these EV charging that you're going to be placing. So understanding the number of vehicles is really the fundamental first part. And data and modeling can help forecast how many EVs are coming and by when. So it's not just that raw number, but understanding that diffusion curve so you know when to place your chargers and where. So we know that EV demand has been sparked by national, state, and utility incentives. So accounting for the impact of those changing variables is critical. And then factoring in consumer behavior, which we know is not driven by price alone, is also important. So CSC has used socio-technical transition theory as the tool to make these projections. And we model these projections using a diffusion of innovation, math, and science based on 5 years of data from 16 different jurisdictions around the world to provide a forecast for policymakers of new EV sales by year and the number and type of chargers required to support them. So moving on to now that you know how many vehicles you have and how many chargers you need to support them, the second step is to really determine the location of these chargers. So to do this, we use a tool that allows you to determine the current situation and local priorities. And we have about 60 different factors that decision makers can consider in weighting how they're going to place and where they're going to place these chargers. So traffic volume and patterns, the location of existing EV charging sites, the level of utility infrastructure, proximity to disadvantaged communities or multifamily housing, any land use constraints, and then, of course, custom priorities based on stakeholder engagements are critical to consider. So a quick side note on this. Oftentimes you'll read about EV charging estimates, and it's really important to look under the hood of those models and understand the assumptions that are going into them. I sort of mentioned the initial inputs around the size of the EV fleet, questions about how many of them are battery electric versus plug-in hybrid, what percent are home charged, and then even thinking about how many vehicles are going to be supported by a level 2 versus a DC fast charge, how many types of level 2 and varying DC fast charge power levels. Those are all inputs into a model that will really affect your estimates of the total EV charging needed and the estimated total cost. So this is really just to put a pin in it for you all as you're thinking about how many chargers are needed to make sure when you get an estimate to really understand what assumptions are going into that, because those will dramatically change the results. So now I'm just going to skip straight to the over the due part of the process. And as I mentioned, CSC has done a number of that due part, having deployed well over $250 million of EV infrastructure and go into the check part. So this real world data is going to help you determine if you are on or off course to meet your goals. And of course, it's also going to be critically important to meet any reporting requirements from the IIJA. So the data analysis that you're going to want to make sure you collect from your charging sessions would include the total charging sites based on the type of chargers, total sessions and drivers. A heat map of downtime events will be critical. Any emissions reductions, average energy consumed per session. And here what you're seeing is a sample dashboard of these data. Okay, going quickly through the next. So this is an example where we are deploying 2,000 EV, optimizing the siting. We're not actually deploying them, doing the planning for 2,000 EV chargers in San Diego County. So we've using Carrot EVI to create a suitability index. Let me turn that ahead. And I've saw some notes that maybe there's a lag time, so I'll try to wait a little bit for that slide to come up. So in this example, we used our Carrot EVI platform to create a site suitability score based on factors that, in this case, emphasize access to chargers for low and moderate income groups, such as location of apartment units and low median income. So users of this system can define their own suitability matrix based on their goals. And again, there are about 60 different such criteria in the tool that a user can weight. And the software uses geographic information science and multi-criteria decision analysis to define what a suitable site looks like, and then calculates a suitability score for each grid cell. And here you can see the weighting of these particular inputs in this donut chart in here. So here you San Diego County again, and we'll drill into this, but it's overlaid with almost 10,000 hexagonal cells. And each hexagon is about 0.6 miles across with an area of about a third of a square mile. You'll see these brighter yellow colors denote high suitability based on the criteria, and the blue project lower suitability, again, based on these hypothetical criteria that we entered in for this example. Some parts of the county, you'll note, particularly in the east, are not overlaid with hexagons because those areas are undeveloped. For example, they do not contain roads. So here we've zoomed in on the top ranked hexagon with the highest suitability score based on the factors selected. And this is where you'll want to start installing your chargers first. Removing that hexagon overlay allows you to examine the details of this highly suitable area. So while the software does not recommend a specific site within a hexagon, anywhere within the hexagon is good. This allows for flexibility if specific sites are not available or appropriate for installing chargers. So basically anywhere in here, based on those suitability scores, the weighting that was inputted would be a good place to start. So we can drill in even further, and we'll see that there are a number of features of this hexagon that make it optimum for siting charging, such as a metro station with a large parking lot, a Home Depot with a large parking lot, a small mall with multiple restaurants and shops, nearby multi-unit dwellings. And of course, with the appropriate GIS layer, available right-of-way could also be highlighted. That could be of particular interest to state DOTs. So to sum it all up, these 3 steps, supported by dynamic data-informed software, can assist states, utilities, and all stakeholders to best deploy funds to charge the EV revolution and to transparently report these efforts. As you know, markets and technologies change, and ensuring that these funds are being spent most effectively, expeditiously, and equitably requires a constant review of the data, all of which will help answer the very first question posed, which was, how much charging is needed, where should it go, and by when? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. That was, first of all, super on point of exactly what a lot of people's curiosities are, especially mine, I would say. And thank you for being super punctual as well. So we're we're going to transition this smoothly towards Cassie Powers. But if the audience has any questions, please feel free to submit them through the attendee chat, and we will be getting to them in the Q&A session. So, Cassie, you are up next, and please feel free to take it away when you're ready.
Thanks so much, Eric, and thank you to Forth and everyone for having me here today. I'm pleased to be chatting a little bit about some of the lessons that NASIO and the state energy offices have learned in deploying EV infrastructure, and talking a little bit about opportunities for collaboration and supporting state departments of transportation as they prepare for investment. And so my remarks are going to focus quite a bit on opportunities under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and then highlighting some program models from the states. And so for those who don't know us, I am with NASIO, the National Association of State Energy Officials. We're the member organization for the governor-designated energy offices in each of the states and territories. And we have a number of hats. We play a convening role, host meeting and events for our members. We have a meeting going on right now in Washington. And so we also serve as a liaison between the state energy offices and the Federal Department of Transportation, as well as other federal agencies in Congress. And then we have a research and an analytical arm. The state energy offices are responsible for helping to set and then implement energy policies and programs in their states, and that covers everything from building efficiency to clean energy financing to energy emergency preparedness to clean and efficient transportation, which is what I'll be talking about today. And so first off, just a little bit of a deeper dive into the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And so there are a number of clean transportation provisions under the Infrastructure Act. I'm going to highlight just a few of the big pots of money available for EV charging infrastructure. The big one is, of course, the National Electric Vehicle Formula Program. This is the $5 billion that is going to flow through the U.S. Department of Transportation via formula to state departments of transportation for investment in electric vehicle charging infrastructure along highways and corridors. And so once states complete their corridors, that'll be determined in consultation with both the state and the Secretary of Transportation. They'd then be able to use some of the funding to help build out charging in workplaces and communities. And so this funding is currently underway. I saw a number of chats about when program guidance is coming out. The first round of guidance is due out any day, sometime in this next week, I believe, will be guidance issued from the U.S. Department of Transportation on the National EV Formula Program, and then with additional guidance, including standards and guidance on Buy America sometime in May. And so there are a number of requirements for the states under this formula program. One of the first steps is for state departments of transportation to develop EV infrastructure plans. There's a lot of conversation about what that means, whether it's going to be a brand new standalone plan, or whether it's going to be a combination of the existing plans and program documents, and we hope to get more clarity when the guidance is issued in a week or so. There's then another pot of money, the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Program. This is $2.5 billion that will again be administered from the U.S. Department of Transportation. And this is a competitive program, and so it'll be open to any public entities. This is also for any alternative fuel. And so it can be electric vehicle chargers or hydrogen fueling stations, as well as propane or natural gas, etc. Half the money, though, is reserved for community charging. And so there is a specific focus also on investing in rural and underserved areas under this pot of money. There's then another program, the Clean School Bus Program. I know it's a little bit outside the scope of this webinar on charging infrastructure, but there's going to be $5 billion through the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, half of which can be used for zero-emission school buses, the other half for clean and efficient school buses. And the last thing I'll just highlight is, I think, as I said in my opening comments, there is going to be a joint Office of Energy and Transportation that has actually already been launched. And so the Secretaries of Energy and Transportation signed an MOU last month, I believe, establishing the joint office. And DOE and DOT and their partners in the national labs are working right now to stand that up. They're going to have a budget of about $300 million to help to coordinate activities between the Department of Energy and the Department of Transportation, as well as other agencies, to support energy and transportation programs and provide technical assistance, standards guidance, etc. So this is a lot of information, but a lot of opportunities under the Infrastructure Act to support transportation electrification activities. And so now I want to turn to a little bit of just background on where states are with EV charging station build out and planning. one of the things that we've heard a lot about from other partners is just the concern that with this new pot of money, states will just start from scratch and not leverage existing efforts, et cetera. And so I wanted to just showcase what some of the states have been doing thus far. There are, as we can count it, 23 states that have an official EV roadmap or a planning document of sorts. And so almost half have something that is written. Some states like Florida have an electric vehicle infrastructure master plan. It focuses heavily on infrastructure itself. Other states like Colorado have an EV roadmap, which talks about transportation electrification more broadly. There's a lot of different ways that states have gone about this, but in about half of the states, there is an official document already in place. There's now at least 9 additional states that have some sort of an electric vehicle working group or another type of a planning process in process. And so the state of South Carolina is an excellent example of this. They are currently have launched an electric vehicle stakeholder engagement process, have formed an advisory committee consisting of different state agencies, key partners from utilities, private industry, et cetera, to help guide the state as they develop plans and to invest in EV charging infrastructure. And then one other item we just wanted to highlight is that 47 states have committed a portion of their Volkswagen funds to EV infrastructure. This was a big pot of money a few years ago to help states invest in alternative fuel vehicles broadly. States could use up to 15% of their allotted amount for EV infrastructure. And almost all of the states have used at least a part of that towards EV chargers, which is exciting. So this is, again, just to demonstrate that there's a lot already happening in most of the states. And I'll highlight just a few specific state examples now. And so NASIO hosted a webinar series over this past month, which invited these states as well as Oklahoma, Virginia, South Carolina, and Oregon to talk a little bit about their EV infrastructure programs. I can drop a link in a chat to the recordings of those because those are where you'd be able to hear from the states, and it's good to hear about all of the details. I'm just going to highlight some of the takeaways. Each of these states have approached EV infrastructure build out in a different way, but have met with different types of success. And so the state of Nevada, this was a governor-led initiative. They launched the Nevada Electric Highway, which was really a partnership between the state and their IOU and the energy. And they're focusing on building out EV chargers along key corridors in the state. A huge focus on rural and underserved areas, obviously, because there are large stretches of highway in the state where there isn't a lot of infrastructure, period, not even to mention EV chargers. But again, this is more of a top-down approach with a partnership from the state and the utility, and the network is almost complete. The state of Florida really took more of a planning approach, and so the state's Florida Department of Transportation issued an electric vehicle infrastructure master plan, which laid out where DC fast chargers should be and really a holistic plan to EV infrastructure investment in the state. This was complemented by an EV roadmap and an alternative fuels resiliency plan that was developed by the State Energy Office. And these 3 items help to plan for a holistic rollout of chargers in the state. And the interesting thing here was that there really was a focus not only on building out infrastructure along key corridors, but also along evacuation routes. And finally, the state of Michigan. Michigan undertook some really extensive siting and analytical models in partnership with the university to identify the optimal locations for fast chargers in the state. Michigan is really approaching EV infrastructure build out through the economic development lens and is funding these stations through a 1/3 funding model. And so 1/3 of the infrastructure is funded by the state, 1/3 is infrastructure is funded by the utility, and 1/3 is funded by the private sector. And so again, each of these models are a bit of a different approach. But one of the things we did want to highlight is that in each of these states, as well as most states that have rolled out EV infrastructure, it has required extensive collaboration between state agencies as well as with utilities and other partners. I did also just want to highlight that in addition to individual state activities, there are a number of regional electric vehicle initiatives currently underway. I won't list all of these, but as you can see, most of the country is part of some sort of a regional electric vehicle exchange. And so whether it's in the West through the Pacific Coast Collaborative's West Coast Electric Highway, Rev West in the Intermountain States, the Midwest signed the Rev Midwest MOU in the past couple of months. The Southeast states had the Southeast Regional Electric Vehicle Information Exchange. And then, of course, the Transportation and Climate Initiative's Northeast Electric Vehicle network. And then in addition to this, of course, there are the ZEV states, the states that have adopted California's Clean Cars program and are working with each other under a ZEV MOU. And so this is to show that when state departments of transportation or other state agencies are getting started in this space, your state is likely already part of an existing regional EV initiative that you can tap into. And I did just provide a little bit of additional information on one of the regional initiatives, Rev West. This was launched in 2017 when the governors of 8 states signed a memorandum of understanding to work together on EV infrastructure investment along key corridors of the Intermountain West. Since that time, over 175 DC fast chargers have been installed along those corridors. The states also work together to develop voluntary minimum standards for the stations, which are available online, and that most of the states are working and adhering to through their EV infrastructure programs. And finally, I wanted to just share that NASIO has been working with several key partners, including NREL, AASHTO, ICF, Atlas Public Policy, and others, to help support states as they are thinking about EV infrastructure planning and investment under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. We've held a series of virtual events in the past half year or so that's culminating in an online resource, the EV State Planning Clearinghouse. This is going to be a one-stop shop for state agencies as they plan for and implement EV infrastructure programs under the Infrastructure Act. And it's really going to be a repository for documents from the states. These will be the citing and analytical tools that are available right now, but also model RFPs, contract documents, and more in the weeds administrative items that states need when standing up a program. And so this is set to launch in the next week or so keep an eye on your inboxes, and we hope to have that available soon. And with that, I will wrap up and turn it back. Thanks, Eric.
Awesome. Thank you, Cassie. Those were a great deal of information. So really, really excited to see that EV State Planning Clearinghouse as well, as we hope to see more of those models and tools being available. And attendees, please feel free to continue contributing your questions. We'll be getting to them very soon. And now I'd like to turn the floor to Leslie and have her talk about equitable considerations for transportation agencies as it relates to charging. So Leslie.
Thanks, Eric. Hi, and good morning, everyone. My name is Leslie Aguayo. I'm a Climate Equity Program Manager with the Greenlining Institute. The Greenlining Institute is a racial equity organization. We're located in Oakland, California. And for the last 29 years, we have been working on how to operationalize equity. And so today I'm going to talk more about how we can deploy EV charging infrastructure in an equitable way. So first, I'd like to start by sharing Greenlining's definition of equity. So for us, we hold that equity is transforming the behaviors, institutions, and systems that disproportionately harm people of color. Equity means increasing access to power, redistributing and providing additional resources, and eliminating barriers to opportunity in order to empower low-income communities of color to thrive and reach their full potential. And to be clear, equity is not the same thing as equality. Equality is the assumption that the playing field is level, while equity acknowledges that people are starting from very different places. And equity is also a practice. It is not just a milestone or a goal that is completed or checked off a list. It is a consistent practice. And so I wanted to share that definition before diving a little bit deeper into how we can apply these definitions to charging infrastructure. And today I want to address 2 questions. 1, what are key equity issues that must be addressed in charging infrastructure spaces? And 2, what can transportation agencies do to ensure charging infrastructure deployment is done equitably? So to answer the first question, we have to pay really close attention to this issue of accessibility versus deployment. So through SB 1000 here in California, the California Energy Commission has released preliminary results addressing this issue. The CEC was tasked with, quote, assessing whether charging station infrastructure is disproportionately deployed, using parameters that include population income, population density, and geographical areas to inform proportionate deployment of charging infrastructure. And their study identified a key difference between accessibility and deployment. The deployment of charging infrastructure geographically might be perceived as equitable because it's being deployed in disadvantaged community census tracts, but they may not be serving the priority populations living in those tracts. And this might be due for a couple of reasons. It could be that the deployment of these charging stations are placed in a location that is technically a disadvantaged community census tract, but it's actually in a low density zoned area, or an industrial or commercially zoned area where the density is really low and therefore technically a disadvantaged community, but it's really hard to reach for people that live around the area. Another reason could be if a charging station is deployed in a disadvantaged community census tract, but the station is actually located on a campus that is part of a private company where only employees that work at that location can access the infrastructure. Another example could be if a charging station is located off of a major corridor like the 5 freeway here in California, that is meant to be serving only commuters that are coming to and from larger urban areas, but don't necessarily live near that charging station themselves, where oftentimes the communities that do live near the highways are bearing the brunt of that pollution. And so in order to ensure equitable distribution of charging infrastructure, we have to pay really close attention, measure and understand this gap of accessibility and deployment. So that brings me to the second issue I'd like to highlight, and that is ensuring that the focus is on people in priority populations, and that must be central to all charging infrastructure investments, right? We want to make sure the benefits are going to people, not just place. And so first, it's important to remember who it is that we're referring to when we're talking about equity and equitable investments. Who are the populations that we're trying to target for charging infrastructure, and how will they be using and benefiting from this investment? Transportation at its foundation is simply a way for people to get from point A to point B, and therefore people should be central to the design thinking and ideation process, not the technology itself. And so charging infrastructure should work to not only improve transportation options, but ideally create benefits that improve quality of life. And this includes various clean mobility options that serve people's needs that isn't specific to just privately owned passenger vehicles, right? This can look like electric buses, electric school buses, micromobility, public transit, and active transportation modes. And so the third issue I'd like to bring up here is understanding how we can remove the barriers to this burgeoning green economy. In the United States, the dominant way to build wealth has been through home ownership, and that market has been riddled with discrimination and was incepted under racist ideals. But there's this new emerging green economy that presents an opportunity to create new forms of wealth building and allow communities of color that have been locked out of this opportunity to acquire intergenerational wealth, to actually be able to capitalize from federal electrification and transportation investments. And so for us, we published a year ago, the Greenlining the Economy guidebook that really emphasizes 6 steps, as you can see here on this slide, on how to create a green economy equitably and how to implement strong community investment standards. And I won't go through them, but I'm happy to share more about that after. And so for us at Greenlining, one of the main ways that we operationalize equity and we actually make equity real is through our 4-step Making Equity Real framework. And so this can be applied to climate investments and also transportation. And so again, here, it's really important for transportation agencies to consider these 4 steps in their implementation processes, as well as their funding plans. And so we want to make sure that equity is baked into 1, the goals, vision, and values of this program or funding plan or implementation. 2, the process, right? How are transportation agencies actually making decisions with community members that are going to be affected by the investment? 3, implementation. What are the outcomes that are going to be expected, and how are community members involved in this process? And finally, analysis and measurement. How can we actually measure for equity and create metrics along the way so that we can go back and analyze if our equity goals were actually met? And so I want to draw particular attention here to the fourth step in our operationalizing equity framework, which is measuring for equity and creating equity metrics. It is really necessary to consider additional data sets that speak to relevant deployment, public health, diversity, land use, and climate change data when considering charging infrastructure implementation. As you can see in these maps of Oakland, the same communities that were redlined back in 1937 are the same communities most impacted by poverty and pollution, and were also hit hardest by COVID this time last year. And so because these communities continue to be affected by economic, environmental, and health impacts as a result of redlining, it is critical that we not only prevent repeating the same mistakes of the past, but undo the legacy of redlining by prioritizing investments in these communities first and foremost. And so expanding data and creating flexibility to consider emerging data sets is really important, especially as we see multi-year investment strategies for decarbonizing our energy sector and transportation. And so here I'd also like to highlight that to date, electric vehicle charging investments have historically been deployed in well-resourced, early adopter, higher income, and wider census tracts, or low-hanging fruit areas. These screenshots were taken from a Washington Post article that came out last December in 2021. And it highlights that if we continue to deploy charging infrastructure through this profit-driven model, we're locking out low-income communities of color that are being left behind and continue to face disproportionate pollution burdens. And so transportation agencies should prioritize disadvantaged communities census tracts and also set minimum investment standards in order to prioritize and be held accountable to investments in these communities. And so some examples of this that are already being done are through the California Energy Commission, who was tasked with meeting 35% investment goals of their portfolio in disadvantaged communities, but has actually surpassed that to invest up to 50% of their total investment in disadvantaged communities. And we're seeing similar minimum investment standards in the Justice 40 initiative, with 40% of investments going to disadvantaged communities. And so finally, I'd like to go ahead and recap some of the recommendations that we have for transportation agencies. Again, first and foremost, we should make sure that all agencies and utilities and stakeholders share common definitions of equity and who populations they're trying to serve are clearly defined. We also want to make sure that transportation agencies are thinking about accessibility and not just deployment. We want to ensure that investments are targeted to people and not just place. We want to remove barriers to this burgeoning green economy and make meaningful community investments. We want to operationalize equity through community-driven decision-making processes. And lastly, we want to set minimum investment standards that not only meet the status quo, but are actually ambitious and surpass some of all these already met standards. And so with that, I'd like to end and close. I'm happy to answer any other questions. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Leslie, and thank you, Karen. Thank you, Cassie, so very much for the wonderful presentations. I actually already saw a lot. I've already seen a lot of great questions being coming out in the attendee chat, and also there's been some interesting discussion as well. So, first question I would just highlight. I think Cassie has already answered that. Will be the states with EV roadmap plans include. This is going to be testing me whether if I can read all the abbreviation of the states. But for the sake of simplicity, I would say please go to the attendee chat for the answer that Cassie has provided. There's a long list of states ranging from Alaska all the way to Washington State. You will be able to see those in the question in the attendee chat. But we do have a lot of interesting questions. And first one that I'd like to invite everybody's answer, and I would probably throw in a few points of mine as well, is because it concerns with multifamily dwellings or multi-unit dwellings when it comes to charging deployment at these places. The question said whether if there should, what's the question actually says, to help determine where chargers should be placed, it's not just proximity to multifamily homes that matters. It's having access to charging in these multifamily homes or on site so that the resident can access the lowest cost electricity via their utility residential rate. And whether if there's a way to expand the three key questions to center equity while we focus on this area of MUD residents, because it also obviously concerns with equity, considering a lot of residents living in MUDs who could be highly likely be categorized under the medium low moderate income category as well. So I would probably send this question first to Karen, and then Cassie, maybe you can provide yours, and then finally we'll have Leslie wrap up if that's okay. And Karen.
Yeah, I really like the way Leslie framed it about people, not places, because obviously multifamily housing varies from low income to very, very high income, as well as single family. And depending on the location, there are many single family, low income housing that does not have access to a driveway. So thinking about sort of garage orphans, if you will. But I think there is a way, and again, our tool is based on public charging, which the federal funds are not for residential, they're for public. Utility programs, however, are often for residential. So I think there's, depending on which program you're trying to optimize and what the goals, those 60 different factors, those were just sort of a melange. There are ways to think about areas with high rental, may be a place to look at as well. But the federal funds will not be are eligible for public charging, which of course is, $5 billion and $7.5 billion isn't going to be enough. But I really like thinking about the people, not the places. And again, sometimes multifamily is not always low income. So I think figuring out how you focus on the people you're trying to serve, which could be workplace charging, could be actually a solution as well to address that.
I think one thing I'll add also is that level 1 charging is also an excellent option for many EV drivers, depending on your driving patterns. If you don't need to go more than 20 or 30 miles a day, you likely don't need a charging station. You can use a level 1, just an outlet. So, that's a little bit outside of the scope of the Infrastructure Act conversation, and opportunities with federal funds, but something to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I'll just add, similarly echoing, that it's really important to consider who is living in these communities because, as Karen mentioned, oftentimes we can count charging at multi-unit dwellings as an equity requirement or as an equity benchmark, when actually it can be considered a really like a luxury condominium, for example, where the people that are living there are not the ones that need assistance, for example. And so there have been a couple of programs in California that have piloted car sharing options at affordable housing sites. So that has been something that we've been looking into. There is also thoughts about bills at the national level on how to expand and scale this kind of piloting program as well. So maybe it isn't necessarily that it's a charging station at a multi-unit dwelling that is specific for vehicle owners, but there could be some kind of car sharing program for residents of that area to be able to access clean transportation.
Yeah, those are wonderful answers. I would say focus on the people is really, really a very, very interesting highlight that I would want to highlight myself as well, because I've been working on a MUD project myself in the past 2 years, alongside with great people at CSE. And one thing that we definitely have realized from that project is there are so many barriers and so many variation at MUD buildings that every one of them are so different. It's really hard to recommend that or give just a blanket statement that yes, it's going to be better on site or it's going to be better in a proximity. It really comes down to what are the community members that specific infrastructure is serving, and whether if that specific sites even have the infrastructure to be able to do that. Because to be honest, a lot of EV charging implementation level 2s at residential areas are more like luxury, as mentioned by the speaker, instead of a basic amenity that everybody could enjoy, because it comes with a very heavy capital cost alongside with it. But I do think having that focus on serving the people and serving the specific group that the funding has in mind would probably be a really good guiding principle moving along, instead of, sure, everybody have charging at home would be great, yes, but there are realities that we'd have to consider as well. But that was really good discussion, so thank you very much. And here are a few questions that probably directly goes to Karen, and we can probably get them out of the way related to the Carrot tool. There are two simple questions. Number one is, can you tell us a little bit more about the data needs or data input needs for that specific tool, and also whether if that tool is going to be proprietary or is it going to be public available? What's the access situation for that tool?
Yeah, so in order for us to build the model for a specific jurisdiction, we need a number of vehicle data, and I can provide the person with those elements. But really understanding, because we use diffusion of innovation to build that S curve, we need to understand where that location, that jurisdiction is on the diffusion, on the adoption curve. And then we can place there. I will say that, we have had Carrot for a left time now, that we were able to project forward. And then when we saw the real data for the national, it matched up. So it was sort of cross-referenced by doing the projection and then having the real data show up a year and a half later and seeing that it matched the projection. It is a proprietary patent pending tool, but we certainly love working with states and utilities and other nonprofits in providing data-informed decision-making to, again, our goal is to decarbonize, and we know that we've got this one shot with these funds. We want to make sure that we are the most efficient, expeditious, and equitable in the deployment of them. So that's why we rely on data.
Thank you, Karen. And then another question I think that could probably go to everybody on the panel, which is, currently we do see a lot of deployment mechanism or deployment strategy adopted by, say, IOUs, focusing on deploying EVSE at high density areas of electric vehicle adoption or electric vehicle ownership. What might be your opinion about that? I think Leslie has mentioned this a little bit, saying that those are like low hanging fruit, but most likely in rich neighborhoods. However, what might be everybody's opinion on that, and how can we safeguard ourselves to really deploy that better? And then I also have a follow-up question on that, will be, should EVSE priority adoption, should EVSE deployment prioritize adoption of EV or the utilization rates of these infrastructures? So question to all the panelists here. But anyone can go first. I wouldn't assign anyone to go first this time.
All right, I'll start. I was counting to 10 to see if someone else would step up. So in terms of that last question around utilization rate, I think it's a really fascinating issue, because charging, there's the daily need, which, as Cassie pointed out, for the most part, folks will not need to charge daily because their travel is much less. It's more sort of going to be long distance travel, where people are, for Thanksgiving or other holidays, are going to visit grandma, that they'll do those long trips. So those chargers may be used sporadically, but when they're needed, they're really needed to make that final trip. So I think we need to think about it in two ways. It's not just a charger that's always being utilized, is probably one that's congested and you probably need more. I don't know if we've identified what that right amount of charging is, but there'd be nothing worse than showing up needing a charge and there's a line backed up, right? So I think we also need to think about the long distance trips, and I think that would be, I don't think we've done much thinking about that and how charging deployed to accommodate those longer trips are needed.
Build off of that also, to your point on where utilities are investing in charging stations as well as the private sector, it makes sense to invest in areas where there's a high uptake because that's where the chargers will be used. That's where there's a chance of recouping costs. And that's where I think there's a really important opportunity through this federal funding to fill gaps in underserved areas where there is not a business case and where it's really difficult to incentivize private sector investment. These funds can help to fill those gaps and really front load the cost so that there will hopefully be greater uptake in electric vehicles and then greater need and a better case for private sector investment in other stations later on.
Leslie, you might be
Thank you. I was just saying that I'd like to add, that this concentration of chargers in predominantly urban areas does tend to serve early adopter folks that do have access to resources to technology. However, I think being really strategic about where that placement is in urban areas and in suburban areas, right? And thinking about the long-term timeline. By the time that these investments are ready for use and they're shovel ready, are the populations that you're aiming for still going to be located in these census tracts or in these cities, right? We're seeing a large increase in the suburbanization of poverty. We're seeing a lot of folks leave urban areas and come back in because they're workforce centers. That I think thinking about the long-term projections of demographic data and also land use and climate change, right? Thinking about, is an urban center still going to exist in the next 10, 20, 30 years, or is it going to be underwater, or is it going to be in a climate, a fire risk zone is also really important to consider. And so I think thinking in the short term and the long term is really important.
awesome. So if anything, I'm going to just give my quick summary of what I thought in terms of what I've, after hearing all of your thoughts. I think number one, focusing on adoption is probably going to be better, as in focusing on improving adoption for everybody when we deploy these EVSE, because it's going to provide everybody that safety net, that basic infrastructure to enable them to feel comfortable and confident in their electric vehicle. Hence, they will be able to adopt confidently as well. And that is also where the utilization rate probably might not be as high in certain areas when it's corridor charging, when people are just passing by using it once or twice throughout maybe their entire year of driving. But still, there's not really once again, there's no silver bullet. Adoption and utilization both are important, but really comes down to the scenario of that decision making. So finally, we're at time almost, but I do want to get everybody in the audience out with a little bit of possibly actionable suggestions. And this is the question for everyone, which is, which groups of key stakeholders should the transportation agencies engage to develop their electric transportation roadmap and implementation map as they move along with this, with the possible new fundings? Which one or a handful stakeholders you would highly recommend the audiences start engaging as, I believe, or I consider it actionable item after today's discussion? And anybody can shoot first.
This is Cassie. I can start. Obviously, with my NASIO hat on, the state energy offices, they have a long history of EV infrastructure build out and program administration, and in many cases we're the authors of their state's EV roadmaps or plans, and so they are key stakeholders. Beyond that, there's a long list: utilities, private sector partners, and community-based organizations at the top.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think community-based organizations, utilities, public utilities commissions, cities, metropolitan planning organizations, retail fuel dealers and convenience stores would be others, REITs, people that own property, state DOTs obviously have a lot of right-of-way, that they're another group. So anyone who owns key property and focusing on the community-based organizations, I think is also really helpful.
Yeah, I think Karen named just about all of them, but again, highlighting particularly community-based organizations and transit advocates. I think it's really important to consider how our transportation electrification systems can make that transition holistically again, and not just focusing on passenger vehicles is really important.
Awesome. Thank you all so very much. I realize we are almost at time, and thank you so very much for your inputs and your sharing. I'm going to pass the microphone back to Cynthia to wrap us up today.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Cassie. Thank you, Karen. And thank you all our attendees for joining us today. We do have one final wrap-up poll question for you regarding the information shared today. Did you find this webinar informative? We want to make sure we're providing you with some informative, thought-provoking, emerging topics coming out from the industry. And we really appreciate our speakers taking the time and sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you so much, Crystal, for playing that poll. As we wrap up, you saw in the previous slide the contact info for our panelists. Do not worry if you missed this. We will be sharing more information in our webinar recap that will include our webinar slides, our webinar recording, the video, as well as some additional resources from our speakers today. I know, Cassie, you had mentioned a web link for the webinar, and Leslie, you mentioned the Green Economy Guidebook. So we would share that all with you. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the panelists, or you can reach out to myself or Eric, and we will forward the information as needed. We hope you can join us for our next webinar, which is actually February 22nd, not February 8th, on federal EV policy, what's coming next, where we'll have panelists to clarify the status of key investments and policies already being implemented and give a preview on what to expect from DC. We hope you can join us. Thank you all again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.